There is a child on the playground who never joins the game. He stands at the edge, watching. His shoulders are slightly hunched, as if he is trying to take up less space in the world. When another child approaches, he freezes. If the teacher calls his name, he looks as if he has been caught doing something wrong, even though he has done nothing at all. He is the quiet one, the one adults describe as sensitive or shy or a bit anxious. There is another child on the same playground. She is the opposite. She shouts when she is asked to wait her turn. She hits when she is frustrated. She argues with every instruction as if each request is a personal attack. The other children eventually stop inviting her. The adults start speaking about her in that careful, exhausted tone that means they have already decided she is a handful, or worse, oppositional. We look at these two children and we see two completely different problems. One needs more confidence. One needs more discipline. One is internalizing. One is externalizing. But what if they are not different problems at all? What if they are two different faces of the same silent process happening inside the developing brain and the relationships that surround it? Right now, roughly 1 in 5 children in high-income countries meets criteria for a diagnosable mental disorder. Anxiety alone affects about 11% of children between the ages of 3 and 17. Behavior disorders affect around 8%. Depression is less common in younger children, but rises sharply as they enter adolescence. And here is the number that should stop us cold. The majority of people who will struggle with serious mental illness as adults already showed clear signs before their 14th birthday. This is not a small problem. This is a quiet epidemic that has been growing for decades and accelerated dramatically in the last 15 years. Today we are going to do something unusual. We are not going to walk through a list of disorders and their symptoms like a textbook. We are going to follow the developmental cascade, the way small early differences in temperament, attachment, and nervous system regulation can snowball into lifelong suffering. And more importantly, we are going to look carefully at where that cascade can still be interrupted. Because these children are not broken, their nervous systems are doing exactly what they have been shaped to do. Something has changed in how we see childhood. In the 1980s and 1990s, childhood mental disorders were largely the territory of specialist clinics and child psychiatrists. Today, they are part of ordinary school conversations, pediatric visits, and parent group chats. Diagnosis rates for ADHD, anxiety, and autism spectrum conditions have risen significantly. After the pandemic years, the numbers jumped again. Is this better recognition, or is the actual suffering increasing? The honest answer is both. We are better at noticing. Teachers and parents are more aware. Screening tools are more common. Stigma has decreased enough that more families are willing to seek help. That is real progress. Children who would once have been labeled difficult or lazy or just shy are now more likely to receive a proper assessment. But there is also genuine increase. Multiple large-scale studies show that the prevalence of anxiety and depression in young people has risen beyond what better detection alone can explain. And the children who are struggling often appear more impaired than previous generations at the same age. One of the most important findings of the last few years is how powerfully a parent's mental health predicts the child's. When caregivers rate their own mental health as fair or poor, the odds of the child having severe ADHD, severe anxiety, or severe behavioral problems rise dramatically, In one recent study, more than 4 times higher for severe ADHD. This is not simply genetics, although genes matter. It is transmission through daily interaction. An anxious parent is more likely to overprotect and to model threat-focused thinking. An overwhelmed parent is more likely to become inconsistent or harsh under stress. A depressed parent may be physically present, but emotionally unavailable. The child's developing nervous system is reading these patterns every single day, and it is adapting to them. We also live in a culture that has become simultaneously more protective and more demanding of children. We hover. We schedule every hour. We monitor screens and grades and friendships. And at the same time, we expose them, earlier than any previous generation, to intense social comparison, endless digital stimulation, and a world that feels permanently unstable and loud. The result is a generation of children whose threat systems are more easily activated and whose capacity for self-regulation has had fewer natural opportunities to develop under manageable pressure. To understand childhood mental disorders properly, we need a better model than chemical imbalance, or bad parenting, or even genetics alone. The best model we currently have is the Developmental Cascade. Anne Maston, one of the leading researchers in resilience science, describes cascades as the cumulative consequences of interactions across systems over time. A small difference early on does not stay small. It spreads. It recruits other systems. It changes the environment the child then faces. Think of a stone dislodged near the top of a mountain. At first, it is almost nothing, a tiny shift. But as it rolls, it gathers speed and mass. By the time it reaches the valley, it has become something much larger and more destructive. In childhood, the original stone is often something subtle, a more reactive temperament, a slightly slower developing ability to regulate attention or emotion, a parent who is themselves overwhelmed or anxious, a period of chronic stress or instability in the family, or an early difficulty reading social cues. That early difference then shapes the next environment the child enters. The child who is more anxious may be overprotected, so they never get the practice of coping with uncertainty. The child who is more impulsive may be scolded and corrected more often, so they receive less warm attention and more criticism. The child who is slower to read social signals may be left out of play, so they get fewer chances to practice the very skills they need. Then the next cascade begins. Gerald Patterson and his colleagues at the Oregon Social Learning Center mapped one of the clearest and most replicated examples. They called it the dual failure model. Early behavior problems at home, often rooted in coercive parent-child cycles where each person escalates the other, spill into school. The child begins to fail academically and is rejected by typically developing peers. Those two failures then sharply increase the risk of depressed mood and drift toward deviant peer groups. What started as family conflict becomes a multi-domain problem that is far harder to reverse. This is why early intervention has such large effects. You are not just treating a symptom. You are stopping the stone before it gathers mass. The same principle works in reverse, and this is crucial. Competence begets competence. A child who experiences early success in even one domain, a warm relationship with a teacher, a skill that brings genuine pride, a friendship that feels safe, can create positive cascades that protect against later risk. Childhood mental disorders are rarely single, isolated conditions. They are usually the result of multiple small cascades that have begun to reinforce one another. Let us look at the most common disorders through this developmental lens. Anxiety is the most common mental health difficulty in childhood. At its core, It is an overactive threat detection system. The brain is scanning for danger more often and more intensely than the situation actually warrants. In many cases, the cascade begins with a combination of temperament and parenting. A child who is already more sensitive to novelty, separation, or uncertainty meets a parent who is themselves anxious or highly protective. The parent, almost always out of love, removes obstacles, warns of potential dangers, and steps in quickly when the child shows distress. The child learns two powerful lessons. The world is more dangerous than it appears, and I cannot handle it without help. Their own coping muscles never fully develop. Avoidance becomes the primary strategy, and avoidance then prevents the very experiences that would teach the brain that it is safer than it thinks. By the time the child is 10 or 12, the anxiety may no longer look like simple fear of the dark or of dogs. It may look like perfectionism, chronic stomach aches, school refusal, or explosive meltdowns when routines change even slightly. The original sensitivity has cascaded into a full lifestyle of self-protection. ADHD is not a deficit of attention in the way many people still understand it. It is a difference in the regulation of attention, motivation, and emotion, particularly when the task is not immediately interesting or rewarding. The brain of a child with ADHD often has difficulty with what researchers call effortful control under low stimulation conditions. The cascade here often runs through school and relationships. The child who cannot sit still, complete worksheets, or wait their turn receives constant negative feedback. They fall behind academically. Peers find them frustrating or unpredictable. Teachers become exhausted. Over years, the child internalizes a devastating story. I am bad. I am lazy. I am a problem. That story then produces secondary anxiety, depression, and oppositional behavior. Many of the difficulties that look like pure ADHD in adolescence and adulthood are actually the original regulation difference, plus years of secondary cascades of failure and shame. Autism spectrum conditions begin with differences in how the social and sensory world is processed. These differences are present from very early in life, but the secondary cascades are often what cause the greatest later suffering. A child who struggles to read subtle social cues is more likely to be left out, misinterpreted, or bullied. A child who is easily overwhelmed by sensory input may avoid the very situations where important social learning happens. Research consistently shows high rates of co-occurring anxiety, ADHD, and depression in autistic children. These are not coincidental. They are often the result of living year after year in a world that is constantly slightly mismatched to their nervous system. Oppositional defiant disorder and the conduct pathway are the children who look as if they are choosing to fight. But in many cases, the opposition is a signal of deep dysregulation, unmet needs, or a coercive cycle that has been running for years. Patterson's work showed how easily parents and children can fall into mutual escalation. The child resists a request. The parent increases pressure or volume. The child escalates further. The parent either explodes or, exhausted, gives in. Both outcomes reinforce the pattern. Over time, the child's primary way of interacting with authority becomes oppositional, and the parent's primary way of parenting becomes either harsh or defeated. What began as ordinary developmental conflict has cascaded into a stable, destructive dynamic that is now much harder to change. The cascades we have described have always existed. Children have always varied in temperament. Families have always had stress. But several features of modern childhood appear to be amplifying them. screen time is one of the clearest. A large 2025 study published by the American Psychological Association found a bidirectional relationship. Higher screen time predicted more emotional and behavioral problems later, and children who already had more emotional and behavioral problems turned to screens more as a coping strategy. The loop feeds itself. Social media has moved the age of intense social comparison dramatically downward. Children who would once have measured themselves against a small group of classmates now measure themselves against curated highlight reels of thousands of strangers. For a child already prone to anxiety or low self-worth, this is rocket fuel for the cascade. And then there is the mental health of the parents themselves. We are raising children in an era of widespread adult anxiety, burnout, and economic pressure. Children do not just inherit genes. They inherit the emotional climate of the home. When that climate is chronically stressed or unpredictable, the child's developing threat system has far less opportunity to settle into a baseline of safety. Comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception, precisely because many of these pathways share a common final road: difficulty regulating emotion under stress. Whether the original difference was in attention, social processing, or threat sensitivity, the child who cannot regulate well is more vulnerable to secondary problems of every kind. Here's the most important part of this entire conversation. Cascades can be interrupted, and the earlier we interrupt them, the more leverage we have. The strongest evidence we currently have is for parent-mediated interventions. Programs such as parent-child interaction therapy, the Incredible Years, and parent management training do not primarily treat the child's disorder as if it were a static thing inside them. They change the daily interactions that are either feeding or starving the cascade. When a parent becomes more consistent, more warm in positive moments, and more skilled at setting limits without escalation or emotional flooding, the child's nervous system begins to reorganize around a safer pattern. School-based social-emotional learning, when it is done with real skill rather than as a checkbox, can create positive cascades of competence. A child who learns to name their rising emotions, to wait even when it is hard, to repair conflict after they have hurt someone, and to notice their own arousal before it becomes a meltdown, has new tools that protect against future failure. And sometimes the most powerful interruption is simply one reliable adult who sees the child clearly, not as a diagnosis, not as a problem to be managed, but as a nervous system that is doing its absolute best with the history and the wiring it has been given. The research on resilience is remarkably consistent on this point. The presence of even one warm, consistent relationship can redirect a trajectory that looked fixed. We also need a deeper cultural shift in how we think about these children. The goal cannot be to produce perfectly calm, perfectly compliant, perfectly happy children. That has never been the human condition, and it is not a realistic or even desirable target. The goal is to give every child enough safety, enough practice under manageable pressure, and enough relational support that their particular nervous system can find a workable way to live in the world. Some children will always be more sensitive. Some will always need more external structure. Some will process the social world differently and more slowly. That is not pathology. That is human variation. Pathology begins when the surrounding systems, family, school, culture, turn that variation into cascading failure and then blame the child for the result. So, the next time you see the quiet child standing at the edge of the playground, Or the explosive child who seems to fight every single request. Try asking a different question. Not, what is wrong with this child? But what cascade is this child living inside? And is there still time to change its direction? Because for most of them, there is. And the earlier we understand the process, the more power we have to alter it. If this video helped you see a child differently, your own child, a student, a niece or nephew, a neighbor, I hope you will share it with someone else who needs that shift in perspective. These conversations matter more than we usually admit. They change how we show up, and how we show up changes the cascade. Thank you for watching.